marbles in the jar. Legacy code, to me, I know, Michael Feathers wrote his great work working effectively with legacy code, and in there he defined it as code without tests, which I think is amazing and true, and then also, in my world, not complete. Because tests are kind of one aspect of trust. Do you trust the system? But there's also, do you trust the people on your team? Or do you badmouth them and tell them that they wrote really crappy code, right, behind their back? When we want to run and look at kind of who worked on a piece of code last, the command that we use is called git blame. This is so baked into our culture that we don't even consider it. So how do we build trust in our systems, right? And to me, empathy is the fastest way to do it, because empathy works kind of like fission. I think of it as trust fission, right? And those of you who like physics, kind of like I do, fission is a way to just get massive amounts of energy really quickly, right? So if we want to inject massive amounts of trust onto our team, we need to focus on empathy. And we need to focus on delivering communication artifacts in an empathetic way. Because what happens is you have your primary communication artifact, right? So that's the thing that we were kind of working on. So in our context, we'll say like an email or something, right? But then from that, we were like, oh, you know what? This thing over here would actually really help. I explained this once, but I'm probably going to have to use this description again. I think I'll put it over in a wiki or over in our documentation so that other people might use it, right? That's a secondary artifact. And just like fission, you get a byproduct, and that byproduct is trust. The other neat thing about this is that you're not creating more documentation than is actually needed for a project. You're not sitting down and thinking like, oh, well, here's all the big things that we could do, because in this process, you've got that feasibility analysis, right? You have an algorithm piece in there that talks about why it's important to say, okay, this is what I can deliver immediately. So you're not necessarily creating all this documentation for documentation's sake. It just becomes very emergent. So again, we kind of look at this and we started kind of figuring out, well, how can we model this even deeper? And so we found kind of two subdomains within this process, right? And so the first is audience, right? So steps 1 through 3 are really all about understanding our audience, right? First, we're figuring out who our audience is and narrowing down into a very specific way where I'm not thinking about CFOs or the CFO. I'm thinking about Jamal, who is the CEO that I can, kind of learn about, right? And I can picture his face when I'm writing. And even if you don't know that person, that's where personas come in, right? Kind of a synthesis of the research. But you can imagine that person's face. You're defining their needs. You're figuring out kind of what the context is that they're in. But then you've got the action side, right? So, this is kind of mirroring Indy Young's definitional way, You're gathering information first, you're developing it first by learning about your audience, but then you're actually applying that knowledge through perspective taking, right? So you're thinking through what's the best action for this person? What's the feasible action for this person? And then you're delivering artifacts and then creating secondary ones. So, we started seeing, well, maybe we can put this into like a situation. So I'll give you kind of a little overview of how this might work in a relatively real life setting. And so this is a chart that kind of we started, now that we've got this information, here's a chart that might be useful for people who are just now starting to learn about how to do this process. So the first thing we do is we figure out our audience, right? So the context, the bounded context that we're working within here, our primary communication artifact is that we are writing an error message for a bookkeeping app, right? So that's kind of the situation, right? So we're imagining that, I am a developer or you are a developer, and you have been tasked with writing this error message. The reason I pick error messages is because I think they have a lot of room for improvement. And this is how we get there, right? It was like my entire career, I really just want to fix error messages. Like, how can I teach everybody to write better error messages? Well, it starts here. So the first thing we do is we think about, okay, who's going to be using this? So we might go, oh, it's the user. What have we done wrong? Yeah, who's the user, right? Anybody here named user? There might be one person. I haven't met anybody named user. But that doesn't give us that connection. That doesn't give us the information that we need to really kind of think through, what does this person need? So we don't use user. Instead, we say, okay, I'm going to move to kind of a piece of our persona, so there's a role. So this person, based on the research that we've done and kind of knowing who uses our application, this is a freelance artist. Our bookkeeping app, let's assume, really targets, freelancers or people who are working in the gig economy, and it makes it really easy for them. So we know that this is kind of an audience that's going to be receptive, and we've done some research, and kind of the person who represents our audience is someone named Malik. And now we have a connection. Now we can kind of sync up and start that process. But then we don't stop there, right? Because we think through who else, what other audiences are going to be useful. It's never just one. Well, I would say it's rarely just one. I always avoid never and always, always. So we think through, my customer success manager, her name's Tiara. And if I fix this user error, she might want to know about it, right? Because the way that she's communicating to the people who are calling in or emailing about, kind of the product, my work is going to impact her role in kind of her workday. And then my favorite is your future self, right? This is that self-empathy piece of the 6 different types of empathy. We need to consider ourselves. Think about, what does you 6 months from now need to prevent that dreaded state where you pull up some code, but you have no idea what you did or who even did it, or worst case, you run git blame and are cursing whoever did it, and you were like, oh, that was me, right? So now we've identified kind of the very specific people that we're targeting. So next we think through their contexts, right? And we do this for every single one. So the context of Malik, he's using it on the go, right? He's a freelance artist, so he's meeting with agents and he's at galleries, and he's very rarely at a desktop using this, right? And we know this from the research. So that's going to matter, right? Because the user, he's feeling distracted regularly. And so that's going to change kind of our perspective and kind of what we deliver. We think about, Tiara, and what does she need? Well, she's responding to support tickets. That's her context. And there's a lot of pressure to reply quickly and have it be really accurate, right? That's the thing that she cares about. And then you're fixing a bug, but it's been 6 months since you've looked at the code, right? That's kind of the context. So within that context, what does Malik need? He needs resolution, right? Worst thing is in the middle of something, I get an error and it just says error, 1541. And you what do I do with that, right? That might be useful for you, the developer. Is it useful for Malik, who's on the go and can't, send an invoice? No, that's blocking him, right? So that's going to inform you when you actually go to deliver this communication artifact. The customer success manager, what does Tiara need? She needs really accurate information, and she needs it to be really quick, and she needs to be able to call it up really quickly. And then the developer, what do you need, right? 6 months from now. Minimal context switching, right? You don't want to go hunting through all the code and kind of figuring out, and you want to be able to just dive in and see what you need as quickly as possible. It needs to be really easy to understand. So now we have a good sense of kind of who our audience is, and now we move over into the actions section of our algorithm. So we imagine that for Malik, the best action, the blue sky, rainbows, puppies, and sunshine, right, is that we validate his frustration. It's written, if you do nothing else, right, in the second person active voice for error messages, right? And that means that you're using the word you. You're talking to a human. When we're writing error messages, we are writing for people, not for machines, right? And the active voice is, I'm doing this thing now. It's not in the future, it's not in the past, it's right now, right? And then maybe a link to a video tutorial, right? Other people have experienced this, there's this highly produced, amazing thing. That would be just glorious if we had that, right? That would exceed Malik's expectations, right? We imagine Tiara, like, what's the best thing that we could possibly deliver for her, right? If we were gonna just make her day where she was so, so grateful for what we delivered, she's like, if I had reference code in the error message, then I could update, and we could update our response library, right? That Tiara relies on this response library. So she wants to make sure that she can quickly see what is linked to what, so that when she's talking to Malik, who might call in, she knows what's going on the development team, on the development side. And then for you, what do you need? Well, you want to fix all the bugs, right? This is the challenge that Scott falls into, right? He sees one bug and he wants to figure out another one, and it becomes addictive, and that sometimes isn't always practical, right? We've got budgets and knowing that. Next, we think through, okay, what can we actually do, right? Given time and budget and kind of I've got other things that I need to work through, kind of what's something that I can deliver relatively quickly in 2 to 3 minutes? It's not going to necessarily knock me out of flow. It's not necessarily going to interrupt, right? And it's one of these things like, writing a test first, writing a failing test first. Yes, it takes a little bit extra time, but at the same time, it delivers so much value later after you've kind of accumulated a lot of these. So we think through, kind of what's something that I can deliver in the next, 3 to 5 minutes that would preserve some kind of intention of the best case scenario, but I'm not actually going to do the best case scenario, right? So for Malik, we definitely want to validate that frustration. That doesn't take a lot of time, right? We can write our error message in second person, in active voice. That doesn't take a lot of time. There's nothing kind of extra that we have to do around that. And then, the idea of a video tutorial seems good. So, your team has a backlog of just kind of blue sky ideas, so you just kind of toss it in there, right? Because that's what you're able to get done, and it still preserves that idea. Then you think through, okay, now Tiara, what can I do for her? Well, you create, that issue to document the reference code idea, right? You're not actually able to deliver it today, but again, documenting the idea of it becomes important. And then for yourself, you can fix edge cases, when they arise, right? So you're kind of focused on the happy path. That's kind of what people need you to do. You've identified that there are areas where absolutely it would be useful, but we have so few people who are actually calling in about that it doesn't really make a lot of business sense to automate that. We'll do it manually. And just, kind of being okay with that. So last step is thinking through what are the secondary artifacts that arise out of this. These are the extra things that you can deliver. And so, in the secondary artifact, it's a wiki update. Like I said, updating that wiki takes under 2 minutes, adds a lot of trust on your team, right? Shows that you're being proactive. For the reference code, writing up a GitHub issue, right? That's what your team uses. You notice that it would be useful. You don't actually have to implement it. But again, just documenting it and saying, this is something that I've noticed and I think it might be useful, sharing it with the team. And then finally, for yourself, writing clean code, right? Writing code that's self-revealing, tests, would be useful, right? Help you get context later. Writing a clear commit message. There's this thing called a description in the commit message area. So I have a friend, Dave Bach, and he says that a commit message, the message itself, should be the size of a tweet, and the description should be a blog post if necessary. And the reason that commit messages are so useful is because they're tightly coupled with the code itself. So, preserving as much of that intent in your commit message is a really useful tool when you're going back to try to get context. And possibly doing a journal entry. This is something that we do on our team. We, out of this experiment and kind of thinking through empathy, they're in the Apollo mission. One of the things that engineers did is they kept really detailed notebooks with them because they were moving all across in all different teams and they were trying to share information. And a big piece of that was taking very detailed notes of what they had learned so that they can share it with other people. So we started that practice. We just have a wiki page and everybody has it and everybody writes 10, 20 minutes at the end of the day, a reflection, what did I do that day? And there's a developer on our, on our team named Steve, and he always writes in his journal, like, thanks, past Steve, right? Because he's been in this habit of doing this now that he's really starting to realize the benefits. He's documented, like, I ran into this really interesting architectural problem. I don't have the time to deal with it now, but this is how I would deal with it if I could. He's preserving that thinking, and then he runs a search, and he's like, 6 months later, when he actually has that on his plate, he can go and he can refer to the context really quickly. So the way, I know that domain-driven design, it's a big part of that is kind of coming up with these shared and ubiquitous language, right? And that is the process that emerged out of, this very ongoing process that we're doing to really explore how can we use empathy on a very technical level, right? For us, the idea of audience and action as a framework works. Right? It's something that's easy to use, it's easy to understand. Everybody on our team kind of gets it and knows it. And the way that we describe empathy, kind of coming up with all this synthesis, but the way that we describe empathy is that it is proactive perspective taking. You're not waiting for somebody to, share their perspective with you. You're going out and you're seeking it. And you're asking people, what do they care about? You're doing that research ahead of time so that you're informed. And then it's problem solving, which good for us, engineers are natural problem solvers. This is a wonderful thing. And so when we frame it this way, that empathy at its root is about collecting data about how to best interact with people and then doing it, solving that problem. This becomes an incredibly technical skill that is far removed from the just have empathy kind of people that I used to be. So I like to close with this quote from Arthur C. Clarke, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And this is how I felt about software when I first started this industry, when I first joined Corgi Bytes. I had no idea. It seemed like magic. I didn't know how stuff compiled. I used software, but it really felt like magic behind the scenes. And empathy can feel that way. I think that this can kind of be expanded a little bit as well. I like expanding definitions. Where it's not just technology. It's a process that's abstract and you don't understand it. And so can you apply algorithmic thinking and explore other areas that seem magical? And the reason they seem magical is because you haven't explored it. And digging in and looking at that process can actually uncover some of the more technical and rational and analytical processes that are underneath. So I would encourage you to kind of take this forth, enjoy your new empathetic journey. Everyone here has the capacity. One of the questions I get asked is, well, what about people who just don't have empathy? The research shows that unless you're a sociopath, like a clinical sociopath, which I hope you're not at this conference if you're in that situation. But very, 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 very few people have that. So you have empathy. You have that capacity inside you. And my challenge to you is to start exploring this in a way that is curious, in a way that's empowering. Just like these processes of TDD and BDD and DDD, with that same enthusiasm. And I look forward to hearing how this has impacted you in the future. Thank you very, very much. And I think we've got some time for questions.
We have, thank you. Huge thanks to Andrea. Has anybody got any questions? We've got the mic over here.
Don't be shy.
Is there anybody up in the rafters we can't see? Okay, if we have...
Oh, there's one.
Just there. Good spots.
So when you have a conflict, how much empathy do you need to give?
Yeah, conflict, right? So if anybody's read Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, conflict can actually be really healthy on a team, right? And so kind of the other side of empathy is the idea of candor, right? Kim Scott has done a lot of work in kind of radical candor. So being able to actually say what we think, transparency, that's really useful. And so in a conflict situation, which is really just two people not agreeing, which is useful, practicing empathy and saying, okay, how do you really feel, right? Running through this, like, what do you need? What do you value? That's a great opportunity to explore underlying causes. Because a lot of times when people have a conflict, there's kind of a surface level conflict, but then there's a deeper level conflict that may not be exposed. And so running through this process of, exploring if somebody has a conflict with you, saying, how can I understand you better, right? That's the practice of empathy. And then how can I help you solve this problem? And then eventually, that builds trust, and the conflict kind of goes away, and we start learning how to work together a little bit better and have dissent, but sometimes without the hurt feelings. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.